The Enigma Strain. This is the one, folks. This is the one that launched my career to the stratosphere. This is the one that made me famous. None of that's true. I'm not famous. My career did not launch to the stratosphere, but The Enigma Strain was the first book that got me on the path of being a full-time author. It's the book that started it all, if you will. As most of my other books, and I mentioned the others are linked here somewhere, click something. The Depths and The Golden Crystal, now The Atlantis Stone, are the two books that came before The Enigma Strain. And they're both books where I challenged myself in a certain way, specifically with a certain thing or style or something that I wanted to do as a writer, a way I wanted to improve. So the first one, The Golden Crystal, I mentioned, that was just the first book I had ever written, the first long piece of fiction I'd ever tried. And so the goal was just finish the damn book, try to get it done. With The Depths, the challenge I set for myself was try to write the female protagonist as a main character. And I mentioned then that I didn't quite pull it off because I sort of shifted in the middle of the book as I was writing it, and it became kind of a female-male protagonist. It was weird. And so when I started writing The Enigma Strain, I decided the challenge for me then was I was actually going to try to pull off what I had accidentally kind of inadvertently done with The Depths, and that was to write two main characters, a male and a female. But not have one be sort of the main character and one be sort of a sidekick, but have both of them work together as a main character. And so I created the idea of The Enigma Strain around that very thing. At the time that I started working on the outline for The Enigma Strain, I was reading a book by Dwight Swain on characterization. And one of the things I remember from that book was how the character's life has to be tense. There has to be tension in the book. Just everything has to be tense, especially if it's a thriller. But the characters that interact, there should be some tension there. There should be some either fun tension or scary tension or some kind of tension that's constantly ratcheting up until you reach this climactic point in the novel. And so when I started writing the outline for The Enigma Strain, I didn't really know what the story was going to be. I just knew that I wanted these two main characters that were going to be fighting, or at odds at least, with each other. So there's the male-female dynamic, there's the personality dynamic, there's just everything about these two characters I knew needed to be sort of juxtaposed or opposite in some ways. And so I started developing the bare bones of the character who became Harvey Bennett, who is today my best-selling character, meaning all those books are the ones that sell the most. I've got the most books in that series. Most people read The Enigma Strain before moving on to other stuff that I've written. And so Harvey Bennett started as a template of a character that was essentially a recluse. I used the word reclusive when I created the character Harvey Bennett. I knew that he was going to be called Ben. I knew that he was going to be a park ranger, and he was going to be sort of reclusive. That's it. I didn't know his backstory. I didn't know that he was going to start at another park and then move to Yellowstone. I just knew that I wanted this park ranger guy who was sort of escaping something in his past, but didn't quite know it yet, and he was going to go run off and be a park ranger end up in a national park. That park was Yellowstone because in my swipe file, which I've talked about before, in my literal folder of cool stuff, one of the things that I found in there was an article about the supervolcano beneath the Earth at Yellowstone National Park. It's actually the world's largest volcano. It's just this seething mass of magma that's just sitting in a caldera underneath the park and the surrounding area, and it's apparently primed to blow. Now, there's a lot of things about that I could talk about, but the point is most geologists don't think we're in any danger, but the idea is if it does happen to erupt, we're all toast. And so I thought that might be kind of a cool jumping off point for this book. So I had Harvey Bennett, I had this reclusive park ranger working at Yellowstone, and I had this volcano. That's sort of the antagonist of this story. I also knew that I wanted a female protagonist, a main character, who could sort of come alongside Harvey Bennett, but also fight him in a lot of ways and just sort of be his foil. That was the challenge I had set for myself at the beginning of writing this book. So I came up with the character Juliet Richardson. She was working for the CDC, the Centers for Disease Control. She ended up working for this unit within the CDC that I made up called the Biological Threat Research Division, or BTR. because I needed it to be sort of a smaller focus rather than just the whole CDC. And if you've read the book, you'll understand why. I didn't really want to dive into this being a pandemic novel as much as just keeping it mystery thriller. And so I gave her this role at the BTR of sort of being this whiz kid, hotshot, up-and-comer who goes out to Yellowstone when she realizes there's this virus strain that was released into the air. And as we go throughout the book, Harvey and Juliet are sort of at odds, but you can tell there's some tension there. There's some potential like for one another. There's some sexual tension as well, that kind of stuff. And she wants to dig in and pry and figure out who he is. He wants to hide and push her away and just remain reclusive. At the same time, he's got this strong longing for justice and this strong longing to find the truth. And so it just was this really good natural marriage of these two personalities as they fought together and fought each other. And so that became the core of what the Enigma Strain was. As I was writing it, I knew that I had this strong character vibe, but believe it or not, at the time, I had no idea that it was going to be the first in a series. It was never going to be the Harvey Bennett thrillers. It was just Harvey Bennett and Juliet Richardson doing their thing, getting to know each other. And of course, at the end, they ride off into the sunset, happily ever after, all that stuff. But like I did with the other books that still are not series to this day, I wrote in some things at the end that could potentially lead to some other books. Namely, I had this bad guy organization, in the book it's called Draconis Industries, or Drash Global, or Dragon Medicines, or something. There's all kinds of dragon-type words that I used because they were this elusive, kind of multifaceted umbrella corporation. I put in some chapters toward the end that sort of allow you to create or imagine a world where they're still out there. And that became the basis for the rest of the series, or at least the next few books. And so I used this bad guy organization, the Draconis Industries arc, as the way to create more books in the series. So Harvey and Juliet's story arguably could have been done in this one book. But then I used this multi-book character arc of Dragon, organization, Draconis, to be able to write more books in the series. And I used an approach, I think, DC Comics, not the terrible movies, but the actual good comics, a method developed by DC Comics where there's this A story that goes on for a few different books, or comic books in this case. And then the B story comes in toward the middle of that arc, but it's also the beginning of its own arc. And then that becomes the A story in the next few books. And sometimes you can have a C story that comes in at the end. And so there's all these just arcs that kind of, I don't know if that makes any sense, that just sort of line up with one another, or overlap one another is a better way to put it. And then each book is tackling the main arc, whatever that one may be. So the main arc of the first three books in the Harvey Bennett series is tackling Draconis Industries. And it's all but wrapped up, hint, hint, at the end of the Ice Chasm, the third book in the series. And so I didn't do any of this on purpose. It was just sort of this natural, I need to close off some loose ends. I need to tie it up. I need to end the story. But I didn't want to end the Harvey Bennett series. So I would use different elements of the Enigma Strain and then the Amazon Code to develop and introduce new characters that brought their own stories. And it just sort of became this big snowball of story ideas and characters that continued on and still continues on almost a decade later when I'm working on the 12th book in the series. It's been a very prolific series for me. It's been one, it is the series that makes most of the money that I bring in as an author. Mostly through the ebooks, but I also have the paperback versions, the hardcovers, the audiobooks, all that stuff together. I've branched out. I've got water bottles that you can buy that say "Leave me alone." That's kind of Harvey Bennett's thing. He's a recluse, right? Just all kinds of swag and things that are tied into this universe that I created. And a few years ago, I started developing stories in this world, in the Harvey Bennett universe, with other authors. And so, if you've followed me for some time, you might know about the Gareth Red series, or Reggie, as he's known in the Harvey Bennett world, or the Six Assassins series I did with Jim Heskett. It's a 6-book arc that takes place before the Enigma Strain, and it features Ember Clark, who's not related to the universe except through Harvey's younger brother Zach. There's 3 prequel novellas, I guess. They're short novels that feature Harvey Bennett as kind of a young kid, sort of a coming-of-age sort of series that's still got some mystery thriller elements to it, but also has some really interesting characterization stuff that I didn't even foresee happening. One of those books was actually written by the guy who edited The Golden Crystal, as I mentioned a couple videos ago. Mike Morehouse, who's just a really good friend of mine now, and just an incredible writer in his own right. I wrote one of those prequels with Jim Heskett, and they were written after the Enigma Strain. I mean, after probably 5 books had been written in that series, and so they're prequels, but they're also more developed versions of Harvey Bennett that I didn't even really realize was going to happen. So this one book has sort of launched my career. It's launched a lot of different spin-offs in that world. And it's just been an exciting ride. It all started with wanting to write a book with 2 main characters that were male and female and sort of at odds, and this kind of love interest that these days is not really surprising at all, but for me as a new writer, it was something I'd never done before. It's something I'd never thought of trying to do, and the fact that it worked was as surprising to me as the book starting to sell pretty well. So that's the story of the Enigma Strain. There's way more to it. There's way more that you can get involved with. I'll put some links down here. Do subscribe to the channel. There's all kinds of stuff coming down the pipe. Go ahead and subscribe to my mailing list too. You can get this book and the other 2 that I've talked about totally free. And if you haven't yet, check out the new podcast that I'm doing. That's all audio book versions that I'm custom composing and doing all kinds of cool music to, and releasing for free, serialized right here on YouTube, as well as anywhere podcasts are found. Just search for Adventure Explosion and it should show up. That's it for this week. See you next time.